newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and today we're going to be talking about how Idaho is a state too great for hate. Now, I wish I could take credit for that pithy slogan, but it's something somebody made up a long time before me. But we're going to give you a few examples of how the coverage of the GOP convention in the state last week is a really good showcase for well, first of all, what is portrayed as hate within the state and what actually looks pretty hateful on its surface. Now, of course, I'm going to invite you, for those of you who are watching the live feed here, feel free to comment in the comments. I'll address those as I see them come up. But I wanted to start with an example of Idaho media doing what I think was actually a very fair job. And I know this sounds like faint praise. Wait a minute. What are you doing? You're praising these people for actually doing their job. But I have to hand it to KTVB, particularly Brian Holmes, in his coverage of the Idaho GOP convention. Now, this is not to say that, this is a ringing endorsement of GOP politics, but all things considered, I have to say it was really fairly even-handed. So the headline is Idaho GOP adopts 13 of the 31 proposed resolutions. The party affirmed its stance that abortion is murder from the moment of fertilization and that all children should be protected regardless of how they were conceived. Now, this is, of course, on the heels of the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court, which is itself causing a fair amount of controversy here in the state of Idaho over, will abortions, will the trigger law go into effect, which will ban most abortions. And in this case, the GOP was very firm on their stance that, look, we should not be making exceptions. Even in cases of rape and incest, we shouldn't make the default, oh yeah, by all means, abort that child. I know that for most media outlets, that's a temptation to show how heartless, how controlling, GOP members are. But this is something that I think a lot of them have fought for a long time. And so it doesn't make sense to just, well, now that we've finally seen an overturning of Roe v. Wade, let's just throw that all away. Having said that, let's take a look at the other observations made by KTVB. Regarding healthcare, the party believes everyone should be able to exercise free power of choice without intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior forms of constraint or coercion. Now, I don't know if you were one of those people who had to face the very difficult decision of closing down your business or staying away from your place of worship or risking arrest if you took your kids to the park, or for that matter, losing your job if you didn't take the vaccine for COVID. But for people who were struggling with that and who felt that not only the state, but actually the federal government had far overstepped its bounds in mandating those things, I think it's understandable why that would be a resolution that GOP delegates would have signed their names to. The party also passed several resolutions to its education platform, from giving parents the final say on masks and vaccines in schools to opposing all social justice indoctrination. Gotta love those quotation marks, whatever that is. But things like critical race theory, social emotional learning, replacement, and queer theory. Things which have just kind of recently been introduced into our schools as new moral imperatives that, they weren't necessary for many generations. And it does kind of make you wonder why that suddenly is an imperative now. But social justice indoctrination, it's an accurate term, but I guess, to keep in good standing with the woke, you got to keep it in quotation marks just in case anybody thinks you're giving these guys credibility. Now, KTVB also says other past resolutions included a requirement for Republicans to be registered with the party 1 year prior to voting in the primary, and repealing the 16th Amendment from the Constitution, which affects Congress's ability to tax income. Now, this deserves a little commentary for both of these, actually. The idea that people need to be registered with the party a year prior to voting in the primary, I'm sure you've probably heard about some of the gamesmanship which takes place in open primaries where people who are not members of the Republican Party will register as Republican to go vote in the primary, throw their weight and the weight of their cohorts behind a candidate who they know isn't likely to get elected, simply to game the system. And given that there still are lingering questions over election integrity, not just in Idaho, but in most states, there are people very concerned about how easy is it to cheat within the system. I think it's understandable why they would want to uphold, making sure that people who are participating in a party primary are doing so with the right motivation and not just there to monkey wrench the system. Now, as far as repealing the 16th Amendment from the Constitution, which affects Congress's ability to tax income, would it surprise you to know that for the first, 100 and almost 50 years of our nation's existence, there was no income tax? I believe briefly during the war between the states, Lincoln instituted an income tax to help pay for the war efforts. The Supreme Court struck it down as soon as the war was over. But it took a constitutional amendment, the 16th Amendment, passed in 1913, along with the Federal Reserve Act, and along with the 17th Amendment, which took the appointment of senators at the federal level away from state legislatures and put it to a popular vote in the various states. We're going to talk more about that in just a few moments, but I only point this out because people may not realize that this nation tamed a continent, established itself as a leader in the free world, and it did it without an income tax. And I know right now there are people who think, but what would we do? Look at all the programs that require our taxes and that do so much good for us. And I guess these are people who've never considered the concept that maybe government could actually be smaller, or it could do less for us. And what I mean by that is stay out of our way and allow us to do more for ourselves. Because what the federal income tax under the 16th Amendment ultimately accomplished was something that had not existed in America to that point. And that is, it made every single American citizen, everyone who earned wages anyway, personally accountable to the federal government. Prior to that, the only interaction that most people had with the federal government was if they walked into a post office or if they went to visit the nation's capital. In other words, it was very rare. And, forgive me for suggesting this, but I'd like to think that life was a little bit freer at that point as well. Now, the article also goes on to say, in addition to adopting the resolutions, the GOP held party elections on the last day of the conference. Look at this. All of the incumbent members of party leadership lost their re-election Saturday night. Now, I know that was a cause for weeping and wailing, not only in some of the more progressive ranks, particularly in the media throughout the state, but also within Republican ranks, because there are a number of establishment Republicans. I've heard them sometimes not so gently referred to as the Republican mafia, that they're very wed to their power, and they see that as a threat. But it does kind of make you wonder what has taken place. What's the shift that took place that caused people to say it's time to go in a different direction? I have to believe that the events of the last couple of years have something to do with this. Also, this was, I guess, a surprise to some people coming out of the GOP convention. Representative Dorothy Moon was selected as the new chair of the Idaho Republican Party. During her acceptance speech, Representative Moon said, "We were once the bastion of freedom and liberty in this country," referring to the state of Idaho. "There are states that have surpassed us, and we got to make sure with the influx of the population moving in, we have to make sure with the Democrats coming at us with full force that we have our barriers up, our guns loaded, and ready to keep this state free." Now, you can imagine that that went over like a lead balloon with some within the media, as you're going to see here in a few moments. But I don't see anything particularly radical about what she's saying. She's acknowledging there has been a huge influx of people moving to the state of Idaho. And frankly, I don't want to sound braggadocious here, but who can blame them? There's a lot to love here. And frankly, given some of the lockdown mentality that has been so pervasive in states like California, Washington, Oregon, and other places, it's not surprising that they would come where there is more freedom. In fact, I don't feel bad about portraying Idaho as more or less an island of freedom in a sea of otherwise unfree states. So this, I have to say, this was a good job on the part of KTVB in the way that they reported it. Not very sensational. Now, let's take a look at a little less rational and a little more rabid approach taken by the Idaho Statesman. Now, this is an editorial, meaning it's an unsigned editorial, meaning that the editorial board got together and by virtue of their consensus, this is what they had to say, but no one really dares to sign their name to it. And as we go through this, you'll probably understand why. This is some pretty incendiary stuff. Look at the headline. In convention dominated by fear, control, and cruelty, extremists take over Idaho GOP. Wow, at least they didn't engage in hyperbole. And this is the first sentence of the story, or of the editorial, I should say. The most extreme elements of the Republican Party are fully in control after its convention in Twin Falls. The most extreme elements? A convention dominated by fear, control, and cruelty. I mean, the stage is being set here. I hope you put on, a diaper before you started to read this editorial, because it's that scary. I would expect people to lose control of their bodily functions with a lead-in like this. In fact, let's just go ahead and make it official. We're going to dial the fear up to 11 to make sure that everybody understands just how serious this is. So the Idaho Statesman, first of all, starts by noting that the new chair, outgoing Representative Dorothy Moon, who lost her bid for Secretary of State in May, is closely tied to the John Birch Society, which was famously kicked out of the conservative movement in the 1950s when it asserted that former General and President Dwight Eisenhower was a communist. And this is not some tangential connection. Moon's husband, Dar, is on the John Birch Society's National Council. Now, I know it's popular to pick on the John Birchers, and I remember as a kid growing up in the 1980s, I knew a couple of John Birchers, or at least one in particular. You knew him by his flat-top haircut. You could set your watch by it. But here's the crazy thing. As much as it's easy to dismiss the Birchers as just simple, conspiracy theorists, if you've actually read any of their materials, you will find that they're actually very well sourced, and on most issues, they have been proven right. I don't know about Dwight Eisenhower being called a communist. I do know that the mainstream conservative movement was co-opted by Ivy League types like Bill Buckley, who could not abide the principled approach that many within the John Birch Society took. But I don't see this as an indictment of, oh my goodness, Dorothy Moon, she's tied to the John Birch Society. Oh my goodness, they're looking for communists everywhere. Frankly, as I look around today, I see a lot of communist stuff going on, or at least Marxist stuff being introduced to us in the name of social justice. And I have to wonder, were the Birchers really that far off? Maybe not. But let's see how more hysterical they get. The Idaho Statesman talks about how Moon built her entire campaign for Secretary of State on a Bircher-style conspiracy theory, Donald Trump's big lie. What would that lie be? I guess it would be that the 2020 election was stolen. So they say you can expect that she will become that lie's chief public expositor for the next several years. And they say that Bircherite paranoia was also on display with continued efforts to make it easier to disqualify voters in the Republican primaries. Look, whether the Statesman wants to admit it or not, the fact of the matter is there are a lot of people who still question whether the 2020 election was on the up and up. And I think there's good reason to do this. If you look at the people who screamed the loudest in 2016 when Donald Trump was actually elected, one of the things that they were crying about was there was election fraud. I mean, for crying out loud, they claimed that Russia somehow interfered with the election and manipulated it and got him elected. And then suddenly these same people who spent the next few years working with everything they had to try to get Trump out of office. I mean, they impeached him twice. They could not remove him from office. But we're supposed to believe that somehow they all decided to put aside that animus and just, we're going to be as fair and even-handed as possible and wouldn't possibly monkey with the election or with the system itself. So I don't think there has been what I would constitute as a fair hearing of all the evidence out there. Frankly, I've seen some pretty convincing evidence that there was irregularities. There were also illegalities that have been determined that may very well have tipped, that election in a different direction. Now, I don't know for a fact that the election was stolen, but to say that people shouldn't question it, yeah, that's a little bit suspect in and of itself. And this is one of the things that Dorothy Moon apparently is not going to let go. I say good for her. We need to know that it's hard to cheat in an election. And by the way, the idea of making it easier to disqualify voters in the Republican primaries, I explained that earlier. If people are cheating or otherwise gaming the system, it should be easier to disqualify them if that's their goal. If they want to be fairly represented, let them register as what they're going to vote with, and don't sit there and let them get away with monkey wrenching the system. But the Statesman doubles down even more. That's not the worst of it. If the new GOP leadership were simply crazy, that wouldn't be the biggest change in the world. After all, the party's current platform holds that you shouldn't be allowed to vote in U.S. Senate races. Let's take a moment to unpack that. They're talking about the 17th Amendment. And when they talk about you shouldn't be allowed to vote in U.S. Senate races, what they're talking about is there is definitely a movement, and I've seen it among, some GOP voters, maybe among a lot of independents as well, that they should repeal the 17th Amendment. And here's why. Under the original construction of the Constitution, prior to the 17th Amendment, senators were appointed by state legislatures. And by doing so, this solved a problem in that the states had representation in the federal legislature. Now, if you think about it, this is where the genius of the founders really comes through. The House of Representatives, which is elected every 2 years, were the direct representatives of the people. In other words, they were elected by the popular vote of the people of their states and the districts that they represent. That makes sense. But the states needed representation in the federal legislature as well. And the Senate, being the upper chamber, they were appointed by the states' legislatures. Now, what that meant in practice is that those senators had allegiance to the states, which sent them to Washington, D.C. They represented the interests of those states when they went to Washington, D.C. And with the 17th Amendment, which took that appointment by state legislatures and turned it into a popular vote, the loyalty and the allegiance of those senators shifted from the states that they formerly represented to the federal government. You look at how those senators behave these days, and it's very clear. That's where their loyalty lies. It's with the federal government, not with the states that they represent. The states have become subordinated, and that matters because it was the states that created the federal government. It was the states that came together in a compact known as the U.S. Constitution, which called the federal government into existence to represent their mutual interests at the federal level. And I know this is going to sound unkind, so I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Masses are easier to fool. If you can get your name out there, if you can spend enough money to get people, a name imprinted in their mind or fear in their mind about a particular candidate, it's very easy to stampede the herd in a predictable direction. It's a lot harder to stampede a state legislature in a predictable direction, especially if they are looking out for the interest of the state. And this is where the senators had accountability prior to the 17th Amendment. So it may be spun as, well, you shouldn't be allowed to vote in U.S. Senate races. But I think it's worth understanding, why did the founders have that system in place in the first place? And has it served us well? From a federalism standpoint, it was another nail in the coffin of the states' rights and states' powers. And we should not be ashamed for calling it out as such. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier where Dorothy Moon had talked about, look, we're ready. We got our barriers up. Our guns are loaded. Oh, my goodness. Look at the hysteria here. But the new GOP has signaled it also intends to be cruel. Our guns are loaded, Moon cried in her victory speech. You notice how this is lacking some context? I mean, like, really, really lacking context. Almost as if they, they want to almost invoke, the statesman wants to invoke a mental image of Dorothy standing up there shooting a gun into the air. That's how unhinged it sounds. And there's this final parting shot. She also trotted out an old Republican trope that the party was ready to keep this state free, as if some effort was afoot to make Idaho not free. Are you following this? What happened over the last couple of years, the lockdown of businesses, the criminalizing of church congregations meeting, the forcing of masks everywhere you went, all of that was just a figment of your imagination. Nobody was trying to make the state not free. Nobody's trying to tax money away from you and put it to dubious purposes like controlling the climate or otherwise, taking care of a number of progressive pet projects. So get those crazy ideas out of your mind. Keep this state free. Well, okay, thank you, statesmen, for showing your true colors. And of course, it wouldn't be complete without a parting shot about abortion. As the Idaho Capital Sun reported, the party rejected efforts to express support for an exception in Idaho's abortion ban for cases where the mother may die without one. The Idaho GOP's values? Let her die. Such cruelty is now integral to the party. Wow. Again, I just would say it would make sense to me that what the GOP is doing here by standing firm on the idea that we should not start immediately carving up exceptions and watering down to make abortion simpler and easier and more socially acceptable, that doesn't equate to their attitude is just simply let her die. But I guess the statesman has weighed in on this, and this is where they're coming from. Isn't that a contrast, though, between the way KTVB, and in particular, Brian Holmes, who is not especially kind to conservative points of view? Nonetheless, I think he did a much more fair job of reporting this and at least giving the benefit of the doubt to the actions of what took place there at the GOP convention than the Idaho statesman. And I sincerely hope that they have a friend to sit with them as they cope with this cruelty and this horror that's been visited on the GOP. My goodness, it sounds like it's all falling apart. All right, I'm going to shift gears now, tongue out of cheek. Experts say Idaho law and culture complicates hate crime response. Now, this can be kind of a tricky thing because hate crimes are laws that artificially enhance or increase the punishment for a particular crime by adding something, an enhancement penalty, if you will, if someone is believed to have been thinking or holding unapproved thoughts. Now, the story from idahonews.com puts it this way. The number of hate crimes reported to law enforcement agencies dropped slightly in 2021, according to a report from the Idaho State Police. But experts say the state's laws and culture make some people unlikely to report hate crimes and others unlikely to see justice when they do. The article goes on to say, Idaho is one of 18 states that don't include hate crime protections for LGBTQ people, according to the advocacy organization Human Rights Campaign. By the way, they are a very powerful lobby, just so you know. I know that they're an advocacy group. They're a very strong lobby and special interest that is looking for government power through legislation. Though they say most of the local law enforcement agencies still track so-called hate crimes based on federal standards. 4 states, Arkansas, Indiana, South Carolina, and Wyoming, have no hate crime laws. Now, does this mean that a person is free to go out there and victimize anybody who's from an unpopular group? Not at all. You know why? Because they still have laws on the book that make it wrong to do anything that would be considered a mala in se offense, meaning something in which there is a victim, an act that would be considered evil on its face. So murder, rape, robbery, arson, fraud, theft, assault, any of those things are still very much a crime. They're just not hung up on, well, but which group does the victim belong to, and can we use that to finagle somehow a more strict penalty? Now, the article goes on to say, only a handful of hate crime perpetrators ever face malicious harassment charges in court. That's according to the Idaho Supreme Court's online database. Only 6 hate crime charges were filed in state courts in each of the last 2 years. Actually, I think that's probably a good thing. I would be much more concerned if virtually every crime suddenly had a hate enhancement attached to it. I'll explain more about that in just a few moments. The Crime in Idaho annual reports show that dozens of hate crimes are reported to the state's law enforcement agencies every year. In 2021, 47 such crimes were reported, the bulk of them targeting people because of their race or ethnicity, followed by crimes targeting LGBTQ people. That's a slight drop from the previous year when 54 hate crimes were reported. But check out this next part. Nationwide, they say only about 44% of hate crime victimizations were reported to police between 2010 and 2019, according to a report examining hate crimes in the U.S. by the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics. Okay, hold up there. How do they know that only 44% of those hate crime victimizations were reported to police? In other words, how do you know about the other 56% that supposedly weren't reported? This brings to mind, a claim that I've heard from some climate activists that, did you realize every year 1,000 undiscovered species go extinct? I mean, that sounds terrifying, right? But if they're undiscovered, how do you know that they went extinct? How do you know there's 1,000 of them? I mean, is it always such a nice round number? Or is somebody just, goosing the numbers to try to make a point? The article says of those reported to police, only about 13% were confirmed by police investigators as hate crimes, though the remaining 87% also met the report's definition of a hate crime because the offender used what they're calling hate language or left hate symbols at the crime scene. Now, look, treating people hatefully, I'm not going to suggest that that's a good thing. But at the same time, I think it's worth fleshing out the idea that hate crime penalties and hate crime enhancements are largely unnecessary if you have a society that truly treats people equally before the law. Isn't that the goal? Wasn't that the purpose of why we have a justice system? Isn't that why the blindfold is there on Lady Justice as she holds the scales of justice in her hands and the sword with which punishment is meted out? It's to ensure that justice is blind. Everyone is equal before the law. So if my 87-year-old mother were walking across a store parking lot and she were attacked and mugged by someone who's trying to steal her purse, that would certainly be a crime, right? You'd have the theft aspect, you'd have the assault aspect. That would definitely be a crime. If the same thing were to happen to, let's say, a gay man, this is where advocates of hate crimes would say, well, there ought to be an enhanced penalty. Why? Because this guy was part of a protected group. Now, is the actual crime done any different? A person has had property stolen. A person has been assaulted. Seems to me it's the same injury. But now we want to try to get into the mind of, well, but the person may have said something unkind as they were carrying out the attack, and therefore maybe there should be a hate crime enhancement. The bottom line is hate crime laws tend to divide us up. They tend to thrive on the idea of group identity or identity politics, and that is to basically keep us all as little squabbling tribes, all looking for advantage, all looking for power over one another. That's not a recipe for a harmonious society. And this isn't to downplay and say, therefore, some groups are fair game. No, this is affirming that no one is fair game. Whether that person is from a so-called protected group or whether that person is from a mainstream, majority group, a crime is still a crime. And there are still laws on the books that deal with every conceivable kind of crime, and there have been for many, many generations. This is the foundational work to try to create a thought police who can punish people for holding unpopular opinions and to enforce correct attitudes in society. Are we sure that's a road that we want to go down? I mean, I know this is going to strike some people as very unreasonable, but what another person thinks in their mind or the kind of ideas they carry in their heart, that's none of your business. And it's none of my business. As long as their behavior is peaceful, that's the only objective measure by which we can gauge whether they are behaving decently or indecently. And if a person's behavior is destructive or if it's causing harm, yes, absolutely, they should be held accountable before the law. At least to the extent that they can be held accountable for actual harm caused and make the victim whole to the best extent that they can. But as far as what a person wants to do, if they want to sit on their doorstep and think hateful thoughts about this group or that group all day long, I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a very healthy way to do it. But it certainly shouldn't be against the law. And the reason for that is because no matter how pure your thoughts may be, you may think they're as pure as the driven snow. I promise you, someone somewhere would take exception to them and, given the opportunity, if they had the legal mechanism, would punish you for thinking those thoughts. So, if a person's behavior is peaceful, let them think whatever they want. If it's important to you that people don't carry around hateful attitudes, my best advice is be the example then. Show by your behavior what it's like to be a truly good, magnanimous, and caring and tolerant person. And by doing so, you're not letting evil come into the world. You're not letting hate come into the world through you. Believe it or not, that's actually a very successful way to affect positive change. Let's finish here with a quote from Michael Rosef. I think this is very pertinent to this topic. Hate laws are not socially healthy. Hate laws institutionalize society's divisions. They perpetuate the faulty system by which pressure groups obtain special interest legislation. They build upon faulty legal theories, and we surely do not need more of those. They exacerbate society's ever-present divisions. They have a host of problems and potential downsides. I agree. And this is why when people are upset over the idea that we don't have hate crimes laws, we need these so bad, do we really? Forced association does not build community. It doesn't bring people closer together. That's something that has to happen on a voluntary level. If you want to live in a society where people really get along with each other and really value each other, that's something that has to be freely chosen in order for it to be authentic. If they're just going through the motions because there's some sort of Damocles hanging over their heads, I don't know. That doesn't sound like a very healthy society, and it sounds like one that's very much in danger of engaging in thought control. I'm not so sure that that would be a good thing. This is Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our